I want you to close your eyes for a second. Just place yourself directly in the specific moment in history.
Okay.
The date is late January, sliding into early February of 1973. The Paris Peace Accords have literally just been signed. For the American public, watching the evening news in their living rooms, this agonizing, decade-long chapter of the Vietnam War is officially closing.
Right. The narrative is totally set. United States involvement is ending. There's a ceasefire on paper, and across the globe, American prisoners of war are packing their bags. They're preparing to finally come home.
Exactly. The champagne is popped, the diplomats are shaking hands, but out in the dark, far away from those polished signing tables in Paris, there's a completely different reality playing out.
Yeah.
In the dead of night, a top-secret U.S. spy plane bearing the call sign Baron 52 is flying low over the incredibly dense mountainous jungles of Laos.
It is just a profound historical irony. The treaty is signed, the ink is literally drying on the documents, but the operational tempo in the sky above Southeast Asia hasn't missed a single beat. While the American public is exhaling this collective sigh of relief, the crew of Baron 52 is flying right into the teeth of one of the most heavily defended, lethal airspace corridors on the entire planet.
And that disconnect between the peaceful narrative being sold in Washington and the violent reality in the skies over Laos, that is the driving force behind today's deep dive. We are unpacking one of the most contentious, deeply unresolved casualty cases in American military history.
And we have a massive stack of source materials for this deep dive.
We really do.
We're talking declassified National Security Agency signals intelligence, explosive, under oath testimonies from a Senate Select Committee, detailed forensic crash dynamics reports, and the meticulous, decades-long, open-source investigative work of a researcher named John Baer.
Now, if you're looking at this mountain of documents and wondering, why should you care about a cold case from 1973, I want you to imagine the sheer weight of a half-century bureaucratic wall.
Wow. Yeah, picture that.
Imagine standing in front of that wall, knowing the truth of what happened to your brother or your son is on the other side, but your own government refuses to let you look.
It's infuriating.
You should care, because this story pulls back the curtain on how intelligence is actually gathered and interpreted in the fog of war. It reveals the mechanics of how massive bureaucracies can literally bury the truth to protect political optics. And perhaps most importantly, it shows the absolute lengths a family will go to for a loved one left behind.
So we have a lot of ground to cover today.
We sure do.
We are going to examine the final flight of Baron 52. We'll look at the highly contradictory physical evidence found at the crash site, evidence that, frankly, simply defies the laws of physics if you believe the official narrative.
Right.
We're going to dig into the intercepted enemy radio messages caught just hours after the crash. We'll explore the fierce ideological battles that raged within the U.S. government regarding the fate of this crew. And finally, we will reveal newly uncovered geographic and military data that points to exactly where the truth might be hiding today.
Let's start with the backdrop. What exactly is Baron 52 doing flying over Laos if the war is supposed to be ending?
Well, to understand the mission, you have to understand the geography and the shadow conflict happening within it. The Paris Peace Accords addressed Vietnam, but the CIA and the U.S. military were still running a massive, highly classified secret war in Laos.
Because Laos was technically a neutral country.
Technically neutral, yes. But the reality on the ground was that the Ho Chi Minh Trail, the primary logistical artery for the North Vietnamese, ran right through the eastern edge of Laos, completely ignoring international borders.
And we shouldn't think of the Ho Chi Minh Trail as just some dirt path through the trees, right?
Oh, not at all. That is a massive misconception. By 1973, the Ho Chi Minh Trail was a highly sophisticated, heavily defended, mechanized supply web. I mean, it had way stations, underground barracks, fuel pipelines, and brutal anti-aircraft defenses.
It was an entire infrastructure.
Exactly. It was the absolute lifeblood for moving PAVN, the People's Army of Vietnam, for moving their soldiers, tanks, and artillery south. The U.S. military desperately needed to know exactly what was moving down that trail, peace treaty or not. They needed to know if the North Vietnamese were using the ceasefire to secretly rearm and prepare for a massive offensive.
Enter Baron 52. I was looking at the specs for this aircraft in the sources, and it's fascinating. This was an EC-47Q. If you were picturing like a sleek, supersonic, high-altitude spy jet like an SR-71, you need to completely adjust your mental image.
Yeah, totally different beast.
This was a Goonie bird. A slow, lumbering, converted World War II-era cargo plane.
Yeah.
It is unarmored and incredibly vulnerable.
But what made the EC-47Q valuable wasn't its speed or its armor, it was what was inside. The entire fuselage was packed with highly classified airborne radio direction finding equipment. They called it ARDF.
Right.
Essentially, they took this old cargo plane and turned it into a giant flying antenna. The mission was to fly in these specific, predictable patterns over the jungle, listening for the radio spikes of PAVN units communicating with each other on the trail below. By picking up those signals from different angles, they could triangulate the exact position of enemy forces.
Operating all that gear required a highly specialized crew. On the night of February 4th, there were 8 men on board Baron 52, divided into 2 distinct groups. You had the 4 front-enders. This was the flight crew responsible for basically keeping this slow target in the air.
Right, that was Captain George Spitz, First Lieutenant Severo Prim III, First Lieutenant Robert Bernhardt, and Captain Arthur Bollinger.
And then in the back of the plane, physically separated from the cockpit, you had the 4 back-enders. These are the electronic warfare specialists.
The guys doing the real heavy lifting for the intelligence gathering.
Exactly. They were the cryptologists, the guys wearing the heavy headphones, dialing in the frequencies and intercepting the enemy chatter. That group was made up of Sergeant Dale Brandenburg, Sergeant Peter Cressman, Staff Sergeant Todd Melton, and Sergeant Joseph Matejov.
And it's a really sobering detail to note from the sources that Joe Matejov had just celebrated his 21st birthday 3 days before this flight.
3 days. That is just, yeah. So late in the evening of February 4th, Baron 52 takes off from Ubon Royal Thai Air Force Base for what they called a midnight smoker mission. They are heading into Servain Province in southern Laos. And we have the actual radio logs from that night, and things go south very quickly in the early hours of February 5th.
They really do. At 1:25 a.m., the flight crew radios a platform called Moonbeam. Moonbeam was an airborne command and control center, basically a C-130 loitering high above the battle space managing the various flights. Baron 52 reports that they are taking anti-aircraft fire, though they haven't been hit.
15 minutes pass. At 1:40 a.m., they radio Moonbeam again. The tone is completely different now. It's urgent. They report they are taking heavy, radar-controlled anti-aircraft fire. Now, for someone who doesn't study anti-aircraft artillery, what does it mean that this was radar-controlled?
It changes the entire threat level. See, earlier in the war, anti-aircraft fire was often optical, so gunners aiming by sight, trying to lead the target, throwing up a wall of lead and just hoping the plane flew into it.
Right.
But radar-controlled AAA meant the North Vietnamese had sophisticated tracking dishes locked onto the EC-47Q. The radar automatically calculates the speed, altitude, and trajectory of the plane and feeds those firing solutions directly to the guns. And it's designed to detonate at a specific altitude, filling the sky with deadly shrapnel. For a slow-moving, unarmored Goonie bird, being locked up by a radar-guided battery is an absolute nightmare scenario.
And after that 1:40 a.m. transmission about the radar-controlled fire, complete radio silence, Baron 52 vanishes from the net.
Right. And when an aircraft misses its scheduled check-in, the military protocol is immediate. 15 minutes after that missed call, Moonbeam initiates a massive search and rescue operation, a SAR mission.
But locating a downed, dark aircraft in the mountains of southern Laos in the middle of the night is practically impossible.
No.
It takes 4 agonizing days just to locate the wreckage. It isn't until February 9th that they finally managed to get boots on the ground. I was reading through the after-action reports of this insertion, and it is incredibly tense.
They used HH-3E Jolly Green giant helicopters to drop Air Force pararescueman PJs directly into the jungle canopy. These PJs are the elite recovery specialists of the Air Force. Their job is to get in, find survivors, treat the wounded, and get them out. But the conditions they faced on February 9th dictated everything that happened next.
The records show they were on the ground for exactly 40 minutes. 40 minutes to secure, investigate, and document the wreckage of a massive cargo plane crash. Why such a microscopically small window?
2 intersecting crises. First, aviation fuel. The helicopters hovering above, providing cover and preparing to extract the PJs, were burning fuel at a rapid rate. You simply cannot run a helicopter dry over hostile territory.
Of course.
Second, and more importantly, the tactical situation on the ground was deteriorating rapidly. The crash site was sitting right in the middle of a heavily trafficked PAVN sector. The PJs reported a very real, very terrifying threat of enemy booby traps surrounding the wreckage, and they knew enemy reinforcements could swarm them at any moment. They were completely exposed down there.
So they have 40 minutes of pure adrenaline and chaos. Let's look at exactly what the searchers reported finding in that window. The plane had hit the jungle canopy, flipped completely upside down, and burned. The post-crash fire was incredibly intense. The aluminum fuselage was essentially resting on the jungle floor.
And in the front section, where the cockpit used to be, they found 3 bodies. These bodies were charred, still strapped into their seats, and they were wearing their fire-resistant Nomex flight suits. The PJs also noted a disputed claim of a possible 4th body found partially trapped underneath the front of the aircraft.
Okay, so that covers the front-enders. But what about the back-enders? The 4 electronic warfare specialists.
This is where the mystery genuinely begins, and it is the key detail that the Matajov family and others latched onto for the next 50 years. The PJs found absolutely no bodies in the back of the plane. None. The area where Brandenburg, Cressman, Melton, and Matajov were stationed was completely empty of human remains.
And it wasn't just the lack of bones or bodies. It was what else was missing.
Exactly. They found no charred Nomex flight suits in the rear fuselage.
Which is a huge detail.
It's massive. Nomex is a specialized meta-aramid material. It is specifically engineered to be fire retardant. It won't melt, drip, or support combustion in the air. Even in an incredibly hot aviation fuel fire, while the suit might char, the structural remnants of the Nomex fabric survive.
They don't just vaporize.
Right. If those 4 men had been trapped in the back of that plane and died in the fire, the charred husks of their Nomex suits would have been sitting right there in the ashes. But the rear of the aircraft was completely devoid of them.
The chaos of those 40 minutes just cannot be overstated. Decades later, one of the pararescue men on the ground that day, Sergeant Harwell Quillian, gave an audio interview that is just haunting to listen to.
Yeah, that interview is intense.
He recalled the frantic effort to pull remains from the cockpit. He specifically remembered pulling the upper torso of First Lieutenant Robert Bernhardt out of the wreckage. But Quillian also detailed a deeply unsettling moment. As he was bagging those remains, he recalled pulling out a femur bone from the wreckage that he believed did not belong to Bernhardt.
Wow.
But in the rush, in the fear of being overrun by the enemy, he put it into the body bag anyway. He knew even then that things were being commingled. They were grabbing whatever they could as fast as they could before the helicopters had to pull them out.
So they make the extraction, the helicopters fly back to base, and then the bureaucratic machinery takes over. Just a few weeks later, on February 22nd, the Air Force makes a sweeping, definitive declaration. They officially list all 8 men on Baron 52 as killed in action PIA.
And this declaration is the foundation of the bureaucratic wall we talked about earlier. According to standard military regulations, you cannot declare a service member killed in action without conclusive evidence of death. For the front-enders, given the remains found strapped into the cockpit, you have a solid argument for conclusive evidence. But for the back-enders...
They had nothing.
Right. The military had 0 remains. They had 0 Nomex suits. By their own regulations, lacking conclusive evidence, those 4 men should have been listed as missing in action.
And there were high-ranking people within the military command structure who knew this KIA declaration was fundamentally flawed, and they tried to stop it. Look at the story of Lieutenant Colonel Lionel Blau. He was the operations officer in charge of the detachment that the 4 electronic warfare specialists belonged to. He knew these men. He knew the mission. When the word came down that the base commander, Colonel Francis Humphreys, was preparing the paperwork to declare everyone KIA, Blau intervened.
And Blau didn't just casually disagree.
No, he went directly to Humphreys and pleaded with him to halt the KIA paperwork. Blau told his commander that he had access to highly classified intelligence, specifically SIGINT, or signals intelligence, that strongly indicated the backenders might still be alive and in enemy hands.
So what was Humphrey's response? I mean, you have a subordinate officer telling you there's hard intelligence that your men are alive, and you were about to sign their death certificates.
Humphreys flatly refused to look at the intelligence. According to Blau's later accounts, Humphrey stated that he did not possess the specific, top-secret, SCI-sensitive, compartmented information clearances necessary to view that level of signals intelligence, and he had absolutely no desire to get those clearances.
He just didn't want to know.
He told Blau he just wanted to close the book on the incident and move on. He actively chose administrative closure over investigating the survival of his own men.
That kind of willful blindness from a commanding officer is staggering. And the psychological toll it took on the rest of the squadron was immense. Look at what happened to Lieutenant Michael Moore. Moore was actually supposed to be the pilot flying Baron 52 that night. He was taken off the flight schedule at the last minute and granted emergency leave because his wife was undergoing a biopsy for suspected cancer.
So Moore is back in the States, dealing with a profound family medical crisis, and he gets the call that his plane went down. When he returns to his base, reeling from survivor's guilt, his commanding officer slides the official incident report across the desk and tells him to sign it. The report concludes that all 8 men, his crew, perished in the crash.
Moore reads it and immediately refuses to sign. He tells his CO that the conclusion is completely unsubstantiated. He points out the lack of evidence in the rear of the plane. He calls the report inaccurate speculation.
But the military isn't a democracy. Moore was given a direct, lawful military order to sign his name to that document. The trauma of that moment is incredibly raw for him. He described feeling like he was being forced into a conspiracy. He was ordered to participate in a cover-up to hide the fact that members of his crew might have successfully bailed out or egressed from the wreckage. He literally referred to his forced signature as signing a death warrant for his own men.
So we keep circling back to this classified intelligence, the intelligence that Blau begged Humphreys to read, the intelligence that made Moore believe his crew was alive. Let's finally crack open RIFNO 1983. This is the declassified NSA signals intelligence that researcher John Baer spent years fighting to bring to light.
This is the smoking gun of the entire Baron 52 narrative. Exactly 5.5 hours after Baron 52 called in that they were taking radar-controlled fire and vanished, airborne U.S. intelligence platforms intercepted North Vietnamese military communications.
Now, how exactly are they intercepting this? We aren't talking about guys in the jungle with walkie-talkies.
No, the U.S. was utilizing RC-135 combat Apple aircraft. These were massive, specialized Boeing jets packed with linguists and cryptologists flying long, looping orbits off the coast over the Gulf of Tonkin. They were vacuuming up every electronic signal bouncing around Southeast Asia.
And what they vacuumed up on the morning of February 5th was a sequence of 3 specific intercepts. The first one is a preliminary tactical report. An unidentified PAVN speaker comes on the net and reports that an unidentified aircraft has just been shot down in their sector. The timing of this intercept matches the loss of Baron 52 perfectly.
But it's the second and third intercepts, which are retranslations from the actual captured audio recordings, that blow the official KIA narrative wide open. The intercepted message reads, "Presently Group 210 has 4 pirates. They are going to the control of Mr. Van. They are going from 44 to 93. They are having difficulties moving along the road."
We have to break this down word by word. Let's start with 4 pirates. You might think, okay, maybe they caught some local smugglers or bandits. But the NSA linguist who actually translated the original audio in 1973 knew exactly what he was hearing. He added a specific notation to the intelligence report, footnote number 2.
That footnote is critical. The linguist explicitly stated that the Vietnamese word used in the audio was giac. This was not a generic term for criminals. If the PAVN were talking about local Lao irregular troops, mercenaries, or bandits, the standard vocabulary word they used was phi.
Right.
But they didn't use phi, they used GIAC. And GIAC, as footnote number 2 makes crystal clear, was the specific standardized cover term the North Vietnamese military used when referring to captured American pilots and aircrew.
GIAC means Americans, and the number is exactly 4. The exact number of unaccounted for electronic warfare specialists from the back of the EC-47Q.
And this brings us to one of the most contentious points of the entire 50-year debate. For decades, analysts at the Defense Intelligence Agency dismissed this intercept. They told the families, look, we see the intercept, but it can't be about Baron 52. Why? Because according to the metadata on the intercept report, the signal originated from a city called Vinh in North Vietnam. Vinh is roughly 240 miles north of where Baron 52 crashed in Laos. The DIA argued it was geographically impossible for PAVN forces to shoot down a plane in southern Laos, capture the crew, and march them 240 miles north to Vinh in just 5.5 hours.
When you lay it out like that, it sounds like a pretty ironclad debunking. If the signal came from Vinh, it can't be Baron 52. But that completely misses how the whole intelligence setup actually worked and how the PAVN was routing their communications.
It's a fundamental misreading of the intelligence apparatus. To understand why the DIA was wrong, you have to understand a highly classified CIA and NSA program known as the Vinh window, or the Vinh wiretap. The North Vietnamese weren't stupid. They knew U.S. planes were constantly orbiting off the coast, listening to everything. So down in the dense jungles of southern Laos, near the crash site, local PAVN commanders didn't just key up a powerful radio and broadcast their secrets into the open air.
They used a hardwired relay system.
Exactly. The PAVN had laid hundreds of miles of buried communication cables along the Ho Chi Minh Trail. When a local unit in southern Laos captured someone, they would send that message over short-range, low-power tactical radios or literally plug into the hardline buried in the dirt. That signal would travel up the wire, point to point, safely hidden from the airborne U.S. listeners, all the way up to major secure logistical hubs in the north. VIN was one of those primary hubs.
Once the message reached VIN, the commanders there would process the information and then broadcast it out over their powerful long-range transmitters to coordinate with Hanoi or other regional commands.
And that is the exact moment the RC-135 combat Apple planes flying off the coast intercepted the signal. To the electronic equipment on the U.S. plane, the radio wave was physically emitting from a broadcast tower in VIN. So the intercept report notes the origin as VIN. But the content of the message, the capture of the forward jack, the movement along the road, was describing events happening hundreds of miles south, down in the jungle where the message originated.
It's a profound failure of analysis by the DIA. They mistook the location of the broadcast tower for the location of the crime scene. It would be like watching a live news report from a war zone, seeing the anchor in a studio in New York, and concluding that the war must be happening in Manhattan.
Right. And once you understand the VIN window, the geographical objection completely evaporates. The intercept perfectly aligns with the timeline, the terminology, and the missing crew members of Baron 52.
So we have a survivable crash dynamic, missing bodies, missing fire retardant suits, and an enemy radio intercept explicitly discussing 4 captured Americans just hours later. The evidence pointing towards survival is overwhelming. Why on earth would the United States government practically break its own neck rushing to declare these men dead? Why force officers to sign false reports?
You have to pull back and look at the macro-political reality of that exact week in history. Think about the stakes. The U.S. had just signed the Paris Peace Accords. They are in the incredibly delicate, highly scrutinized process of executing Operation Homecoming, negotiating the return of nearly 600 American POWs from Hanoi.
The narrative in Washington is that the war is over and everyone is coming home.
And suddenly, into that fragile diplomatic ecosystem drops Baron 52. You have a top-secret U.S. spy plane shot down in Laos, a country where we are vehemently denying we have active combat operations, and this happens after the peace treaty was signed.
It's not just a tragedy. It is a monumental political embarrassment. It proves the U.S. is violating the spirit, if not the letter, of the Accords by continuing espionage flights, and it proves the North Vietnamese are still actively shooting down American planes.
We have direct insight into this panic from Dr. Roger Shields. He was the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for POW-MIA affairs. He was Henry Kissinger's absolute point man for managing the repatriation of the prisoners during the Paris Accords. In later interviews, Shields was incredibly candid about Baron 52. He admitted it was a uniquely volatile, highly radioactive situation.
Shields stated that admitting we lost a spy plane and potentially had newly captured POWs taken after the peace treaty was signed could have provided Hanoi with the exact leverage they needed to derail the entire repatriation process. They could have halted the release of the 600 POWs already in the pipeline.
And Shields confirmed something else that is truly chilling. The intelligence regarding these intercepts, the 4 pilots' message, didn't just get buried at the squadron level. It went all the way up the chain of command. It went to the Pentagon. It went to Henry Kissinger. It went to the desk of President Richard Nixon. They knew about this intercept while they were sitting at the negotiating table with the North Vietnamese.
They knew there was evidence of 4 men surviving, and they made a calculated geopolitical decision to sacrifice them for the sake of the broader peace agreement. The official line became, all 8 men died in the crash. Case closed.
And that narrative held firm, locked away behind classified doors for nearly 2 decades. But in the early 1990s, the political winds shifted. The families of the missing had never stopped advocating, never stopped digging. The pressure culminated in the formation of the Senate Select Committee on POW-MIA Affairs, which operated from 1991 to 1993.
This committee is a fascinating study in political friction. You had a massive ideological clash playing out on national television. On one side of the committee, according to the sources, you had Senators John Kerry and John McCain, both veterans, obviously.
On the other side, you had Senator Bob Smith of New Hampshire. Smith was drawing an absolute hard line. He was adamant that there could be no normalization, no lifting of embargoes, until there was a full, unvarnished, transparent accounting of every single missing American serviceman. He believed the government had been lying for 20 years, and he was determined to prove it. And I want to be clear, the sources detail this conflict, and we are just presenting the historical record of this clash exactly as the records show it.
The tension during these hearings was palpable. Senator Smith described an environment where he felt he was being continuously blatantly lied to by intelligence officials from the DIA and the CIA. He brought receipts, too. He talked about how his investigative staff spent months taking thousands of individual, classified live sighting reports of American POWs in Southeast Asia and meticulously mapping them out.
They created these massive, room-sized cluster maps. They plotted every reported sighting of a Caucasian man in captivity. And here is where the analytical synthesis is so striking. When Smith's team overlaid the classified NSA signal intercepts, like the Baron 52-4 Pirates intercept and known distress signals onto those maps, they correlated perfectly. The electronic intelligence mapped seamlessly onto the human intelligence. It painted a terrifyingly clear picture of a shadow prison system operating long after Operation Homecoming.
It was empirical, mapped evidence of men left behind. But according to Senator Smith, when the leadership of the committee saw those maps, they didn't launch rescue missions. They mocked them. They called the methodology flawed. And then, in a move that still angers advocates today, Smith stated that the committee actually ordered the destruction of all that data.
Unbelievable.
Those maps, the overlays, the analytical work destroyed so it couldn't become part of the official permanent public record.
It was an environment designed to enforce the status quo. And one of the primary architects of that status quo, the man tasked with ensuring the Baron 52 crew remained officially dead, was a Defense Intelligence Agency analyst named Robert Destat.
Destat is a central, deeply controversial figure in this narrative. As the DIA's lead analyst on the case, he was the one formally tasked with explaining away the REF&O 1983 intercepts. If the 4 pirates weren't the crew of Baron 52, who were they? Destat's answers kept shifting in ways that, frankly, insult the intelligence of anyone paying attention.
In his initial 1992 testimony to the Senate, Destat stated definitively that the 4 pirates intercept referred to South Vietnamese ARVN helicopter crews. He claimed these ARVN crews had been shot down near the demilitarized zone, captured, and were being transported.
The committee asked him for the intelligence backing up this incredibly specific claim. His evidence. He claimed he had a conversation with a friend in the Vietnamese Air Force who vaguely remembered hearing about some captured helicopter pilots.
A friend of a friend. That was the caliber of analysis the DIA was using to override NSA signals, intelligence, and linguistic footnotes. But his story couldn't hold water. By 1996, in internal memos, Destat completely abandoned the ARVN helicopter theory. He pivoted entirely. Now, he started claiming that the pirates mentioned in the intercept were actually just Lao irregulars, local indigenous bandits.
He just completely ignored footnote number 2. He ignored the NSA linguist who explicitly stated that the PAVN used the word "fi" for bandits and GIAC specifically for Americans. Destat simply erased that context to force the intelligence to fit the predetermined outcome. Everyone on Baron 52 died.
Destat's credibility, or lack thereof, is perfectly encapsulated in a wild anecdote from the Senate hearings. It doesn't directly involve Baron 52, but it shows exactly who the families were dealing with. The committee was taking testimony regarding intelligence reports that American POWs had been held in a secret subterranean facility beneath the Ho Chi Minh Mausoleum in Hanoi.
Right. So Destat is sitting at the witness table under oath. He testifies with absolute arrogant certainty that those reports are completely false. He tells the senators that there could not possibly be any tunnels or holding cells under the mausoleum because the water table in Hanoi is far too high. He even joked that anyone trying to build a tunnel down there would need scuba gear. It was a complete dismissal of the possibility.
And Senator Bob Smith had to sit there on the dais, staring down at Destat, and listen to this lie. Smith had to remain silent because he was bound by the classification rules of his own intelligence sources. What Destat did not know was that just weeks prior, during a diplomatic trip to Hanoi, Senator Smith had secretly been taken inside those exact tunnels.
Wow. A sympathetic, terrified Vietnamese official had quietly sneaked Senator Smith underneath the mausoleum. Smith had walked through a massive, dry, Russian-engineered tunnel system. He saw the infrastructure with his own eyes.
Smith knew for an absolute fact that the DIA's top analyst was sitting in front of a Senate committee, lying under oath, constructing false geological narratives to debunk POW sightings. But Smith couldn't reveal his source to call Destat out without endangering the life of the Vietnamese official who showed him the tunnels. It is the perfect metaphor for the sheer, suffocating thickness of the bureaucratic wall the Motov family and others were slamming their heads against.
But while the DIA was spinning tales in Washington, the physical evidence of the crash itself was telling a completely different story. Let's look at the science of the crash survivability, because for decades the assumption was that the plane took a direct hit from a 57mm shell, lost control, and nosedived vertically into the jungle.
That assumption was dismantled in 2016 by a retired Air Force colonel named Ralph Wetterhahn. Wetterhahn is a highly respected crash dynamics expert. He conducted a grueling, exhaustive forensic analysis of the Baron 52 crash reports, the photographs of the wreckage, and the topography of the site. His findings completely contradicted the narrative of a catastrophic, unsurvivable nosedive.
Wetterhahn found that the EC-47Q did not plunge into the earth. It actually hit the dense jungle canopy at a remarkably shallow angle. He calculated it to be about 10 to 15 degrees. The aircraft was traveling between 100 and 170 knots.
This shallow angle of impact is the critical distinction between life and death. Because it didn't hit the ground nose first, the massive, broad wings of the cargo plane absorbed the brunt of the primary kinetic impact as they smashed through the trees of the canopy. The wings sheared off, but in doing so, they dissipated a massive amount of the aircraft's forward momentum.
Wetterhahn calculated that the deceleration forces experienced inside the main fuselage were only between 2 and 5 Gs.
To put that in perspective for you, you routinely pull more than 3 Gs on a commercial roller coaster. Fighter pilots pull up to 9 Gs. A 2 to 5 G deceleration impact is not only survivable, it wouldn't even necessarily render you unconscious.
And Wetterhahn found another crucial detail regarding the structural failure of the plane. During that chaotic slide through the trees, the tail section of the aircraft completely separated from the main fuselage.
This means that when the fuselage finally slammed into the jungle floor and came to a halt, the 4 men in the back of the plane who had just survived a low-G impact were presented with a massive, immediate, and completely unobstructed path of egress out the back of the aircraft. They didn't have to pry open jammed doors. The back of the plane was wide open to the jungle.
The physics and the crash dynamics say they could have survived and walked away, and the archaeology backs that up. In 1993, a joint task force for full accounting JTF-FA finally returned to the mountains of Laos to formally excavate the Baron 52 crash site. This is 20 years after the fact.
You have to picture the scene. 2 decades of jungle overgrowth and scavenging by local villagers looking for scrap metal had heavily degraded the site. But the JTF-FA teams are meticulous. They set up grids, they sifted the soil, they dug through the ash layer of the fire.
And they found very little in terms of human remains. They recovered between 23 and 31 tiny, highly degraded bone fragments. These fragments were so small and calcified that forensic anthropologists couldn't even definitively guarantee all of them were human, let alone identify who they belonged to. They did find a single partial tooth, which was later forensically matched to Sergeant Peter Cressman.
They found some personal effects, including dog tags. But military historians and covert operations experts are quick to point out that finding a dog tag in the dirt does not mean a body burned in that exact spot. Crews flying top-secret missions often flew sanitized. This meant they deliberately took their dog tags off their necks and left them in their pockets or flight bags, ensuring that if they were captured, the enemy wouldn't immediately know their identities or unit affiliations.
The excavation team also found several lap belt buckles from the crew seats. Crucially, these buckles were found in the open, unlatched position, strongly suggesting that someone had deliberately unbuckled them after the impact, rather than the belts burning away while someone was strapped in.
But all of that is secondary to the true smoking gun of the 1993 excavation, the discovery that completely shatters the DIA's narrative. As the team expanded their search grid out from the main fuselage, they began recovering weapons. They found .38 caliber service revolvers. These were the standard issue sidearms carried by the crew.
But they weren't just lying in the ash pit where the plane burned. 2 of these heavy metal revolvers were found buried side by side, meters away from the wreckage. And they weren't just meters away on flat ground, they were meters directly uphill, up a steep 20-degree incline.
Let's pause on that detail and really consider the physics involved. A plane crashes through the trees at a shallow angle, it slides to a halt and burns. The kinetic energy of a crash violently scatters debris, but it scatters it in a cone along the path of the aircraft's forward momentum.
Exactly. Physics does not take 2 heavy steel revolvers, eject them from the aircraft, bounce them meters up a steep hill against the flow of momentum, and then neatly bury them side by side in the dirt.
That is impossible. That specific placement requires deliberate, purposeful human action. It paints an incredibly vivid picture. The plane crashes, the men in the back survive the low-G impact, they unbuckle their belts, they scramble out the massive hole where the tail used to be, they realize the plane is on fire and highly visible, they hear enemy troops approaching, they move uphill, away from the wreck to find cover. And knowing that being captured by the PAV-MIA while carrying sidearms often led to immediate execution, they take their service revolvers and deliberately bury them in the dirt to hide them.
It is an undeniable act of human agency. It is a narrative of survival written in the dirt of a Aleutian mountain. But despite this physical evidence, despite the buried guns, despite the Wetterhahn crash dynamics report, the government simply doubled down. They refused to reopen the case.
In 2016, a contractor for the Defense POW-MIA accounting agency, the DPAA named Guy Bentz, was hired to review the immense portfolio of evidence the families had gathered over the decades. The families hoped this was their breakthrough.
But Bentz's review was a devastating blow. He essentially just copy-pasted Robert Desade's deeply flawed analysis from the 1990s. He dismissed the NSA intercept footnotes. He misidentified the geographical areas of responsibility for the PAVN units. He ignored the uphill trajectory of the revolvers. He maintained the official ironclad conclusion that all 8 men perished on impact or in the fire.
And this bureaucratic stubbornness had devastating real-world consequences for the families. Back in 1996, the Department of Defense took those 23 to 31 unidentifiable bone fragments, placed them in a single casket, and held a group burial at Arlington National Cemetery.
They erected a single tombstone bearing the names of all 8 crew members. By officially burying them with full military honors, the government was legally and administratively sealing the case. They were telling the world, the book is closed. There is no one left to look for.
But the families never stopped looking. They refused to let that headstone be the end of the story. And their relentless push for the truth attracted researchers like John Baer. Baer is the engine driving the modern understanding of this case. He didn't just accept the DIA's dismissals, he decided to bypass the American intelligence apparatus entirely.
This is where the story pivots from an American bureaucratic cover-up to a masterclass in modern open-source intelligence, or OSINT. Baer realized that if the U.S. government wouldn't tell him what happened, he had to ask the people who actually pulled the trigger. He started mapping out the enemy.
Baer's research into the PAVN order of battle is nothing short of groundbreaking. He spent years meticulously translating and cross-referencing Vietnamese military unit histories, memoirs, and after-action reports. He wanted to know exactly which North Vietnamese units were occupying that specific patch of jungle on February 5, 1973.
Remember the NSA intercept we talked about? The one that said, presently Group 210 has 4 pirates. The DIA claimed that couldn't be Baron 52. Baer proved them wrong. He confirmed that Group 210 was the PAVN 210's Anti-Aircraft Artillery Regiment. They were a highly lethal subunit of the 377th Air Defense Division.
And where was the 210th deployed on the night of February 4th? Baer cross-referenced CIA operational reports and Vietnamese unit diaries to prove they were deployed right there in Saravane province, guarding that exact sector of the Ho Chi Minh Trail. Even more damning, he confirmed they were armed with radar-guided anti-aircraft guns, the exact weapons that Baron 52 reported locking onto them moments before they vanished.
So we have the right enemy unit in the exact right location with the exact right weapons, claiming they captured 4 Americans. But what about the rest of the intercept? The message said the pirates were being sent to the control of Mr. Van. Who is Mr. Van?
For decades, Mr. Van was just a ghost in a translated document. But Baer's OSINT work identified him. He found a man named Lieutenant Colonel Luong Con Van. He wasn't just some random officer. He was the political commissar, the political officer of the 377th Air Defense Division.
And why is his job title so important?
Because in the highly structured hierarchy of the North Vietnamese military, the political officer was the specific individual explicitly tasked with the handling, interrogation, and secure transfer of high-value prisoners of war. The intercept wasn't just saying they captured guys, it was reporting that they were following standard operating procedure by transferring American POWs directly to the division's chief interrogation officer. It is an absolute perfect match.
But the most stunning revelation from Baer's years of research solves the final, most cryptic riddle of the intercept. The message stated that the 4 pirates were being moved from 44 to 93. For nearly 50 years, analysts scratched their heads over those numbers. Were they grid coordinates, radio frequencies, cryptographic codes?
Baer figured it out, and the methodology he used is brilliant. He hypothesized that the numbers referred to the kilometer markers along the Ho Chi Minh Trail. The trail was divided into logistical sectors managed by units called Binh Trams. The sector where Baron 52 crashed was managed by Binh Tram 35, which had a massive fixed underground headquarters in an area called Tang Cat.
So Baer knows the headquarters is at Tang Cat, but how does he connect that to the numbers 44 to 93?
He found a needle in a haystack. While scouring translated Vietnamese military journals, Baer found a 2017 article detailing a heroic incident from the war. The article told the story of a political commissar named Nguyen Tuan, who died in 1970 saving a massive gasoline convoy from an American bombing raid. The article, meant to honor this martyr, explicitly stated that his heroic death occurred at a major trail choke point in Tangkat, exactly at kilometer marker 48.
Let that sink in. A propaganda article from 2017 about a guy dying in 1970 provides the exact geographical cipher needed to decode a radio intercept from 1973. Tangkat, the headquarters of Bintram 35, is kilometer 48.
This completely upends the DIA's geographical objections. If the headquarters is at kilometer 48, it means that kilometer 44, mentioned in the intercept as the staging point where the pirates were held, is just 4 kilometers north along the trail.
If you take a topographic map of Laos and plot out Bintram 35, Tangkat, and kilometer 44, it places the captured pirates perfectly within the immediate geographical web of the Baron 52 crash site. It proves, mathematically and geographically, that the intercept wasn't talking about a helicopter crew 240 miles away in Vin. It was talking about the exact patch of jungle where Baron 52 went down, in the exact sector managed by the 210th Regiment.
Bear's research didn't stop there. He also looked at memoirs written long after the war by PAVN veterans, like a soldier named Nguyen Huang, who served in the 471st Division. The 471st was the overarching command that oversaw both the 377th Air Defense Division and Bintram 35. Huang's memoir paints a picture of an incredibly sophisticated entrenched military machine operating in southern Laos in early 1973.
Huang described a network that was vastly superior to what American intelligence assumed at the time. He detailed how they had heavy 12.7mm machine guns guarding every high point. He bragged about how they were successfully shooting down heavily armed AC-130 gunships. And crucially, he detailed their communication infrastructure.
He described an integrated, highly redundant network of wired and wireless communications connecting deep underground command posts to small mobile field units. This memoir explains exactly how a local AAA battery could shoot down a plane, capture survivors, and immediately radio that information up the chain of command, feeding it into the VIN window relay, allowing the NSA to intercept it just 5.5 hours later. The technology, the infrastructure, and the personnel were all sitting right there, waiting for Baron 52 to fly overhead.
When you zoom out and look at the totality of what we've discussed, the survivable low-G crash dynamics, the massive egress path out the back of the plane, the glaring lack of bodies or fire-retardant Nomex suits in the rear fuselage, the 2 heavy revolvers carried 50 meters uphill and buried, the perfectly correlated NSA radio intercepts, the identification of the specific anti-aircraft units, the identification of the specific interrogation officer, and the exact geographic pinpointing of kilometer 44, the conclusion isn't just a theory. It is almost inescapable.
The preponderance of evidence points to an incredibly high probability that Sergeant Joseph Manjov, Sergeant Peter Cressman, Sergeant Dale Brandenburg, and Staff Sergeant Todd Melton survived the crash of Baron 52, egressed from the wreckage, and were captured by North Vietnamese forces on February 5, 1973.
And yet today, they remain officially accounted for by the U.S. government, their names etched onto a shared headstone over a casket of unidentifiable bone fragments in Arlington. Which brings us to a deeply frustrating, broken promise that sits at the heart of the family's ongoing pain.
In 1996, during the height of the battles over the Arlington burial, a high-ranking Department of Defense official named James Wold wrote a formal letter to Senator Bob Smith. The political pressure was immense, and the DoD needed to placate Smith. In that letter, Wold officially pledged, in writing, that the U.S. government would formally petition the Vietnamese government for permission to interview 3 specific high-ranking Vietnamese military officials who were known to have visited the Baron 52 crash site shortly after the incident.
It was a promise to finally ask the enemy what they saw.
Mm-hmm.
Did that ever happen?
No, that request was never made. The diplomatic démarche was never sent. The interviews never happened. It was an empty bureaucratic promise made to get a U.S. senator off their back. And once the political heat died down, it was simply ignored.
But John Baer's incredible OSINT research offers a clear, actionable path forward right now. We aren't guessing anymore. We have the names. We have the units. Baer's ultimate recommendation is that the U.S. Department of Defense must immediately engage with the Vietnamese Office for Seeking Missing Persons, the VNOSMP.
We know exactly who to ask. The U.S. needs to formally request that the Vietnamese government facilitate joint interviews with the surviving veterans of the 210th Anti-Aircraft Artillery Regiment, the 377th Air Defense Division, and the 471st Division. We need to talk to the men who man the 57mm guns. We need to talk to the the men who served under Mr. Van at Bin Tram 35.
And time is the ultimate enemy here. The men who pulled the triggers, the men who sent those radio messages, are in their late 80s and 90s now. We have a rapidly, violently closing window to capture this living history before it is lost to the grave forever.
We owe it to the truth, and we owe it to the families. Families like the Metchovs and the Cressmans, who have spent an agonizing half-century fighting a government bureaucracy that seemed vastly more interested in preserving its own flawless narrative than in actually finding their brothers and sons.
It raises a profound question about how history is officially written. During the Senate hearings, Cedric Tourison, a former DIA analyst and chief investigator for the committee, gave a chilling warning. He explicitly stated that the U.S. government kept two sets of books regarding POW and MIA numbers in Southeast Asia. There was the sanitized, politically palatable set of books shown to the public and the press. And then there was the highly classified, often much darker, far more complex reality hidden in the vaults.
Baron 52 is the embodiment of those two sets of books colliding.
I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over. Strip away the acronyms, the geopolitics, and the Senate hearings. Just visualize the physical reality of that Laotian mountainside in 1973. Think about those 2.38 caliber revolvers. Think about the physical, agonizing act of surviving a terrifying plane crash in the dark, the adrenaline of crawling out of the burning wreckage of a torn fuselage, the conscious decision to walk meters up a steep, muddy incline, digging your hands into the dirt and burying your weapon because you hear the enemy coming through the trees.
It is the ultimate act of human agency. It is a desperate, screaming testament to survival.
If the physical evidence on that mountain points uphill, deliberately walking away from the fire and the wreckage, we have to look in the mirror as a society and ask ourselves, how much of our accepted history is actually just the most convenient narrative? When a massive government bureaucracy rushes to close a book, what chapters are they quietly tearing out? Is the ultimate truth of Baron 52 still breathing in the memories of aging soldiers in Vietnam, or is it permanently, intentionally buried in a classified archive in Washington? It's a question that demands an answer, not just for the 8 men of Baron 52, but for the integrity of the promise we make to every single person who puts on a uniform. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. We'll see you next time.